Y'all, I am kind of overwhelmed that for the first time since 2019, Senator McConnell would do an event outside of Kentucky and would come to Georgia. And I've thought a lot about how to introduce someone who I have in my career in politics praised and criticized back and forth repeatedly. But I think at this venture, at this point in time, when I look back, one of the criticisms that I think Senator McConnell has gotten over time is that, well, it doesn't matter, any Senate leader would do this, except I remember when I was in college and there was a government shutdown, and George Stephanopoulos actually wrote in his book that Bill Clinton's administration was within 24 hours of caving to the Republicans in the House. And he got a call from then Senate Republican leader Bob Dole that the Senate Republicans had come together and they would side with Clinton. And then I remember all of the judicial fights at the beginning of the Bush administration where Senate Majority Leader Lott and then Frist wouldn't fight aggressively for those Republican judicial picks that Democrats wanted to block and filibuster. And I remember the betrayal of so many Republicans who wanted to pass bipartisan campaign finance reform that would just hurt Americans' ability to participate in politics. And in each of those fights, there was a senator from Kentucky who was willing to stand up and fight even when leadership wouldn't, and ultimately got rewarded with that leadership. And here, as he's finishing his tenure as the longest serving Republican leader, and Republicans oftentimes get frustrated and complain, well, we have a United States Supreme Court with a 6-3 conservative majority, and we would not have that Supreme Court but for one man willing to say, I'll take all the blame, I'm not putting Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court. And Republicans were vilified. He was vilified, and he knew by virtue of being the senator from Kentucky that as long as Kentuckians were happy with him, he could do this. And Kentuckians have continued to reward him and send him to the Senate. The Republicans in the Senate have continued to make him the leader. And because of that leadership, what have we gotten? We've gotten the United States Supreme Court, but not just them. We've gotten a rapid push over time to appoint conservatives so that the majority of circuits in the United States judicial system are controlled now by conservatives who are beginning to roll back insanity even in places like the Ninth Circuit in California. But it's not just judges as well. There's been a strategic play over time to be able to grow a Senate Republican base that actually looks very much like America. And sometimes I, as a conservative, complain and say, well, why won't the Senate Republicans do this? And then other times I look at this and say, oh, you know, if we didn't have them there willing to say, I'm willing to be the bad guy and be hated to stop this, things would be a whole lot worse, because I've seen Republicans in the past cave. What I never see is Mitch McConnell cave. Whether I like it or not, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you on stage the Senate Republican leader, the senator from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell. Thank you for doing this. Thank you so much. Now, I've got to start. I told your staff the other day that they called me, and I didn't realize I had a call with them until I was sitting at my computer and I got a notice they were waiting for me on a Zoom call. And they said, unlike the president, Senator McConnell doesn't need your questions in advance. And he said, we'd just like to kind of know the general topics. And I said, well, I wanted to introduce him as the Senate Republican leader who used to be a damn dirty appropriator. They said, well, he still is a damn dirty appropriator in the Senate, but that's okay. I do want to ask you to begin with, you and I, when we had a conversation back earlier this year with my son, who, by the way, his hair is even taller than it was when we were together, we spent a lot of time talking about our role in the world and how my growing up overseas and your role in the Senate, we have this sense that there is something about this country that if we don't lead, others will fill the vacuum who don't share our worldview, and would love to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Eric, America is really unique in the world. You really pick that up when you go almost anywhere else. We've had occasionally these isolationist moods. It happened in the 30s. The slogan, interestingly enough, was America First. That stopped after Pearl Harbor. But then most of the Republicans, including the most prominent Republican at that time, Robert Taft, didn't even support NATO or the Marshall Plan to get the Europeans back on their feet. Well, obviously, after the creation of NATO, it worked. Reagan's approach was, you want to get peace, you do it through strength, through having your adversaries fear you. And I fear, using the word fear again, that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was almost like sending a green light to Putin. Maybe this is a good time to try it because America's going home. We now have seen over a period of time the axis of powerful authoritarian regimes. They're all talking to each other, North Korea, China, Russia, Iran's proxies. So I think the biggest challenge facing the next administration and maybe for the future is for America to look strong and to be strong. The Biden administration sent up 4 straight budgets that didn't even keep up with inflation. That isn't going to cut it. Now, there are those in our party, for example, who say, well, it costs too much. Well, at the height of the war in World War II, we were spending 37% of our gross domestic product on defense. 37%. Now, 2 or 3% is considered adequate. And of course, millions of people were getting killed. So getting into a war is way more expensive than avoiding one. And so I think if I had a message for the next administration, and we all know who we hope will be the next administration, take this seriously. It's the single biggest problem confronting the country right now.
When President Biden was in his first term in the Senate, President Monroe offered up the Monroe Doctrine, trying to keep foreign powers out of the Western Hemisphere. I read in the Wall Street Journal not that long ago that people don't realize the Iranians, the Chinese, and the Russians are all in Venezuela right now. We have a deteriorating situation in Haiti. We have the Peru and Chile also getting in deals with China. It seems like everywhere you look, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians are cropping up now in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, they hate what we stand for. I mean, we have relatively open societies in most of the countries in the world where people actually get to vote on who gets to be in charge. And that, of course, seems to the Chinese and the Russians unwieldy, those democratic elections. They can go either way. Of course, that's the beauty of a free society, is you do have open public debate about reaching decisions. They interpret that as weakness. And so they have pulled together, directly together. President Xi of China went to Moscow this year and said, we were going to be friends forever. And they are collectively a huge challenge to us. And the good news is there are 2 new countries in NATO, Finland and Sweden. 23 countries in NATO are now hitting the 2% of GDP for defense. That was about 3 countries a couple of years ago. The Japanese Prime Minister, addressing the U.S. Congress, said, you want to send President Xi a message? Beat Putin in Ukraine. So it has unified the democratic world, and that's the good part. And I think all of us collectively, if we do what we need to do in our defense spending, are a lot more influential than the axis of evil.
Let me move to the Senate. When you talk either at a state level or the federal level, oftentimes members of Congress will say that the opposition is the Democrats and the enemy is the other house in Congress. House members, of course, in fact, normally when I do this event, the House members want to come on a day that the Senate members aren't present and vice versa. What makes the United States Senate the unique institution it is?
It's probably the only democratic institution in the world where a majority is not enough. The filibuster means that on any matter that's in contention, you have to get 60 votes, not just 51, to go forward. It's always frustrating when you're in the majority, liberating when you're in the minority, but it's the essence of the Senate. Going all the way back to George Washington, according to legend, he was asked, what do you think the Senate's going to be like? He said he thought it'd be like the saucer under the teacup. The tea would slosh out of the cups into the saucer and cool off. Cool off. So the Senate, Eric, has killed so many bad things over the history of our country, you wouldn't believe it. And it was meant to be slow. It was meant to be collaborative or to kill bad stuff. And so the way I measure success in the Senate frequently is not what we did, but what we didn't do. And in the time that I've been there, we've stopped an awful lot of really bad things. But then once in a while, you get to be in the majority. By the way, I've been the majority leader. I've been the minority leader. Majority better. If the stars aligned, as they did during the previous administration, and I was the majority leader, and I was the majority leader in the last 2 years of Barack Obama. And that provided the opportunity only majority leaders have to determine what you're going to do or not do. The single biggest decision of my political career was a decision not to fill the vacancy in the Supreme Court in the middle of the 2016 election. Mm-hmm. At the time I made that decision, everybody thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. We didn't even know who our nominee was going to be at the time I said that. And the Democrats were all laughing, the reporters were all laughing. All you're going to do is, allow Hillary Clinton to nominate somebody younger than Merrick Garland. Well, I thought it was an important opportunity to reserve for us in case we did end up in a position to do it. And so President Trump took very good advice from 2 White House counsels in a row. We collaborated both before and after nominations. And as the majority leader, I get to decide what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. And we took judges up first, every time. Every single time, judges came first. We got lucky. We had another Supreme Court appointment when Justice Kennedy retired. And then out of the blue, Justice Ginsburg passed away with about 4 months to go in the election in 2020. I remember the president and I talking about that. I said, I think we've just got a chance here to meet and get this done before the election, because I thought after the election, no matter who won, we lost the Senate or lost the White House, we wouldn't be able to put together the political support to get it done. We also had the pandemic going on. Now, I can remember one of my colleagues who were worried about getting everybody in some place. One of my colleagues said, well, I'll be there if I have to wear a spacesuit. And everybody understood the importance of it. And we managed to get Amy Coney Barrett confirmed 1 week before the election. And then 54 circuit judges. And there's all kinds of ridiculous comments about what the Federalist Society is. I'm a card-carrying believer in the Federalist Society. What does that mean? The principal goal of Federalist Society, men and women, is to take on what lawyers call the administrative state. Now, to interpret that, that means agencies and departments of the federal government doing things that were not authorized by people who actually got elected, like us. And so the first indication that everything was going to change was 2 years ago in EPA versus West Virginia. EPA decided to regulate carbon. The Supreme Court obviously doesn't have an opinion about whether or not you ought to regulate carbon. All they said was Congress didn't give you the authority to do it. Wham, 6-3, they couldn't do it. And just a couple weeks ago, Chevron deference, which was 50 years old, was the landmark decision that basically allowed the regulators to pretty much do what they wanted to. We had to defer to them. That's why they called it Chevron deference, overturned. So as I look back on my time as the majority leader, I thought, where could you have the most influence for the longest period of time? Obviously, taxes go up, taxes go down, policy changes depending upon the outcome of elections, but the one place where you could have a long-term impact on the country was lifetime appointments to the courts. And don't ever let anybody convince you ought to have term limits for Supreme Court justices. The Constitution is very clear. It's a lifetime appointment. Lose that and you won't have an independent Supreme Court anymore. So Joe Biden last week came out with this goofy plan. And I had an op-ed in the Washington Post last weekend just pointing out how what he was recommending was actually unconstitutional. So I think we have, Eric, had a long-term positive impact on the country that will play out down through the years as these young men and women pursue their lifetime appointments. And it will have a huge impact on the future of our country and reinvigorate the Congress. We won't be able to just punt something to some agency and say, do what you want to do.
Look, yes. You have been in charge of the National Republican, the Senatorial Committee of the NRSC. You've been the majority leader. You've been the minority leader. We have a good group of recruits in a lot of states this year. We've got West Virginia, looks like it'll go our way because of Manchin, maybe Ohio. How do you see the map shaping up for 24 for the Senate?
This is the best map I've ever seen, but one cautionary note, I've seen us screw up maps before. So what is the key to winning a Senate race in a competitive state? Candidate quality. And I'm not going to mention any names, but over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, in 4 or 5 different incidences, we have not had the kind of candidate who could appeal to a competitive state. That is not the case this year. I think we have outstanding candidates everywhere. I believe we've already won West Virginia. That's number 50. 51 is the magic number. We've got big races going on in Montana, Ohio. You just met Sam Brown, introduced him to your audience. We've even got a shot, believe it or not, in Maryland, and certainly in Pennsylvania, and maybe in some other states as well, including Nevada. But the magic number is 51, because that means the majority leader gets to decide what you're going to do. So let's assume for a moment the worst case scenario. We lose the White House, we lose the House, but we do keep the Senate. That preserves the filibuster, because they'll get rid of it. If they get all 3, they'll get rid of the filibuster. They'll admit the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico as states. That's 4 new Democrats in perpetuity. And they'll pack the Supreme Court. That's how radical Democrats are today and why it is so important to win this presidential race.
On the practical aspect of the Senate, I'm trying to think of a way to be delicate on this one, on conservative criticisms that often come up in the Senate. The sense of frustration that we win the House and we win the Senate, but then Republican members of the Senate oftentimes then say, well, I don't want to do what the House does, and conservatives feel like the football has been snatched away. How do you explain to conservatives who oftentimes get frustrated outside of judges that there's a larger collaboration issue there?
There's only one time when the Senate is popular. That's when Republicans are in the minority in the House.
It's a fair point.
So I've been through periods where they pray for us every night and clap for us every night, and periods when you're in the majority when you do want to do more. And of course, in the House, it's a majoritarian body. They run every 2 years. They're doing stuff differently year after year after year. The Senate is harder. The founders of this country didn't want to make it easy to make a law. If you're looking for speed or efficiency, you wouldn't like the Senate. But if you're interested in dividing power and trying to prevent the acquisition of power, the Senate is for you. And I think you have to measure success not by how many things you passed, but how many bad things you prevented. And when you had the opportunity to pass something, did it have a long-time impact on the country? I've been the Republican leader longer than any leader in American history. I've been up and down, but I think when we had the opportunity to move, we did two very important things. Judges, which will last for a long time, and a hugely successful tax reform bill in 2017, but taxes will begin to expire beginning next year. And so that's why it's important to our domestic economy for us to be able to continue to craft a tax bill that allows this economy to continue to vibe.
Senator, I despise using the word legacy because I think those things sort themselves out. You have been the longest Senate Republican leader, and you'll give up that position after this election. We've talked about judges and how that will be cementing your career in not having Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court. But is there one thing that you look at and you wish you had been able to accomplish that you haven't been able to get done?
One thing what?
Is something that you haven't been able to get done that you regret not being able to get done so far?
Yeah, that we haven't won more seats. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of your audience here are history buffs, but if you'll indulge me just for a moment, senators were not even popularly elected until 1914. From 1914 to 2024, Republicans have never had more than 55. Democrats had massive majorities during the New Deal, during LBJ, during the first 2 years of Barack Obama. I always remind people, winners make policy and losers go home. It's not complicated. If you really want to change, you have to win more races. And as I said earlier, I think there have been a number of cases in the last 10 or 15 years where we simply didn't have electable candidates in competitive states. I might mention Georgia, which still looks like a red state to me, but for a variety of different reasons that you all followed very closely, we now have 2 Democratic senators here. I think it's the only red state in America with 2 Democratic senators. And so those were missed opportunities. I can name some others, but those are ones that you're all familiar with.
If we can, there's a growing worry, and Congressman Hearn from Oklahoma with the Republican Study Committee was here, and he and I have this concern about our fiscal state as a country and the growing national debt. And what do you see as Mitch Daniels? So let me back up here. Mitch Daniels had the op-ed in the Washington Post a couple of months ago that he's afraid we're getting to the point where we're going to have a crisis to force Washington to deal with the fiscal problems we have. How do you see that issue?
Look, everybody's afraid to touch it, both sides. But the reason the debt is mounting, except for an emergency like the pandemic, are very, very popular in programs. Medicare, Social Security, extremely popular, essential to a whole lot of members. And unless you adjust somehow the programs, they are going to tank us at some point, and I'm sure an adjustment will be made. The only question is when. The only time I can recall, and this is even before I got to the Senate, Reagan and Tip O'Neill agreed to raise the age for Social Security to 67, which saved the program for a very lengthy period of time. The discretionary budget, the part that we actually vote on, remember on entitlements, we don't even vote on them. That happens automatically. In the discretionary programs, it hasn't been out of sight. But neither side has had the courage to say to the American people, we've got to make some adjustments here. Now, I think what the Democrats would do would be exacerbate the problem by making even more things eligible and raise taxes to pay for it. The other way of looking at it is people are living longer and longer and longer. Would it make sense to have it kick in later? Big, big argument. I can't think of a cycle we've been in when we haven't been accused of trying to do something bad to Social Security, which is not true. But the honest answer is the reason the deficit is so large is because very, very popular programs that neither side has been able to stand up together and say to the American people, this is what we need to do.
Do you think there's going to, is it a crisis that might provoke them from coming together? Or is behind the scenes, is there any recognition that something's going to have to happen? Or it just seems like it becomes the political issue that, as they used to call it, the third rail no one wants to touch? And how do you see it playing out long term?
I don't know when, but it's going to happen if we don't step up and do what's necessary. And it can only be done on a bipartisan basis because of the sensitivity of the subject. I was running for the Senate the first time in 1984. It was the year after Reagan and Tip O'Neill agreed to raise the age of 67. Never mentioned. Wasn't asked a question about it because it was done on a bipartisan basis. I remember talking to President Obama, a very smart guy. We had several private conversations about this problem. He understood what the problem was, but he didn't want that to be his legacy. And I give President Bush 43 a lot of credit because after he got reelected in 2004, he said, we're going to tackle Social Security and see if we can fix it for the long term. We had a majority in the House, majority in the Senate, majority in the White House. We all knew it would require bipartisan support. I was the whip then, the number 2 position. So it became my responsibility to go around to the Democrats in the Senate to see who wanted to sign up to help us fix Social Security. Joe Lieberman, the most reasonable Democrat of all, said to me as follows, and this is the most cooperative, most reasonable Democrat. He said, you guys want to fix Social Security? Go right ahead. Mm-hmm. So there you had unified government trying to do it, but knowing full well that it was so politically toxic that they needed to have both sides involved. And the Democrats in the minority at the time said, oh, we're not going to touch that. That means we're going to run against you in the next election if you go forward. So I'm telling you all the reasons that it hasn't happened, but at some point it will. And it reminds me of the meltdown in 2008, the financial crisis. We acted. It wasn't popular, but we acted. I hate to see this go that far, but I think this $37 trillion national debt is really unsustainable.
I agree. Senator, you did get to the Senate in 1984, and if I remember right, Roger Ailes was involved with your race, and there were a whole lot of people who didn't expect a Republican to win in Kentucky. You did, and you've been there ever since, holding that seat. And Kentucky, I think, has been a remarkable shift in a state now that has moved so decisively Republican outside of occasional problematic Democratic governors there. What do you think has led to the shift in places like Kentucky and elsewhere that we've now seen, where for 50 years, as you mentioned, Democrats have been able to win big, but it does seem like there are so many states that do seem to be moving to the right in the South and the Midwest?
I think that in rural America and small town America, the Democrats' elitism has completely turned them off. You could see it coming under the Obama administration. It only picked up during the Trump administration, and my state's an example of it, and so is Iowa, and so is most of the middle part of the country. I mean, Erick, we do have a Democrat governor. It's an unusual situation, but other than that, you can't find a Democrat in Kentucky with a flashlight. And that's true in places like Iowa, for example, that were very, very competitive states a few years ago. So I think the policies that the Democrats, which are a coastal domination party, during part of my time, of the four leaders, I was the only one not from New York or California. Today, I bet you all haven't thought about this, but today, the Democrat leader of the Senate and the Democrat leader in the House live in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn.
Huh.
So, I mean, they are an urban, coastal, very, very liberal state. This is a hugely problem for the country. If they ever do get full control of the government, the nominee for president on the Democratic side makes the president look moderate, and the president is not moderate at all. So I do worry about the future of the country if they ever get total control of the government, and we need to take the Senate as an insurance policy against what these people will do to the country if they get totally in charge.
Sir, let me ask you one last question. And first, thank you so much for being gracious with your time and coming. And as we head into the future, we don't know what the election's going to look like, what the outcome is going to be. But what do you think, beyond just raw electoral politics, what do people in this room need to be thinking about for the future in terms of the policies that you think will set the country on the right path?
Well, I think the country's obviously in a bad mood, and I don't think people are likely to respond, unfortunately, to anything other than making arguments against the other side. But I can tell you what I'm pretty confident we would do if we were to get the White House, the House, and the Senate. The first thing I think we would do is to try to extend the Trump tax cuts from 2017, and we'd start filling judges. And I think whoever succeeds me is likely to have complete confidence in at least those two things. The third thing is this border situation is an administrative failure of gargantuan proportions. It didn't require new legislation to fix it. The previous president didn't get new legislation to fix it, but he did. And so I think we have an obligation to do that. And to remind people, in order to have the opportunity to do it, the reason we have 40-year inflation is because of a conscious decision the Democrats made in 2021 to dump $2.6 trillion on the economy. And Larry Summers, who some of the old timers in the room might remember, was the Secretary of the Treasury under Bill Clinton, the most prominent liberal economist in the country, former president of Harvard, said at the time, if you do this, you're going to have 40-year inflation. They did, and we do. Not a single Republican voted for that.
Senator, you have been extremely gracious with your time, and I'm flattered you would come all the way down to Atlanta to hang out with us. I really appreciate it, and appreciate more than anything that we do not have to say Justice Garland because of you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, sir.
I really enjoyed it.
I appreciated the comments. Thank you. Thank you very much.